Everybody. Thank you for joining us today for today's conversation on how disinformation campaigns aim to silence women journalists. I'm Sharon Moshavi. I'm Senior VP here at ICFJ. We've worked with more than 165,000 journalists in over 180 countries over the last 37 years. Our mission is to empower this extraordinary network to produce journalism that holds the powerful to account and strengthens communities. As we like to say here, we think that better journalism means better lives. We've spent this unprecedented last year supporting journalists in numerous ways. We created the Global Health Crisis Reporting Initiative in 5 languages, giving more than 13,000 journalists the resources and expertise to cover the pandemic. We developed innovative collaborations between journalists, fact checkers, and social media influencers to combat misinformation and make the facts go viral. And we expanded our research efforts, tapping into our global network to surface trends and really understand the challenges that journalists are facing, from financial sustainability to mental health to disinformation, and now, as you'll hear, online violence. Celebrating World Press Freedom Day this week has served as a reminder, I think, to all of us of the threat to independent media, to democracy, and the vital, vital need for credible journalism. We're in store for an important, compelling, and spirited conversation today about growing online violence against women journalists and what can be done about it. So let me introduce everyone here and thank them all for coming. We have Maria Ressa, co-founder of Rappler in the Philippines, and this year's winner of the UNESCO World Press Freedom Prize, just announced a few days ago. We have Julie Posetti, PhD, who is Global Research Director here at ICFJ, leading our research efforts. And moderating our conversation is Richard Gingras, VP of News at Google and a member of ICFJ's Board of Directors. So thank you everybody for joining us, and let me turn this over to Richard to get us going.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And thanks everyone for joining us as we mark World Press Freedom Day this week. I'm Richard Gingras, as Sharon noted, Vice President of News at Google. I am also very pleased to have been a long-term member of the Board of Directors of ICFJ, a fabulous organization doing tremendously important work, empowering journalists to produce high-quality reporting, serving communities around the world, providing citizens with the information they need to be informed citizens, including holding our powerful institutions and leaders to account. ICFJ, under commission from UNESCO, just released The Chilling, the largest study of its kind to date. It presents an eye-opening look at the breadth, nature, and consequences of the deeply alarming problem of online violence against women journalists. It's a vicious problem that the research tells us has only worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic. ICFJ research also has explored the volume and ferocity of online attacks against Maria Ressa, the celebrated Filipino-American journalist being targeted by the Philippines government. I've known Maria since the early days of Rappler, when the primary topic of our discussions were the challenges of developing a successful online news site, which Maria mastered and did extraordinarily well. I don't think either of us expected what would later follow. What Maria has endured and still faces is horrific. Hundreds of thousands of online attacks that are part and parcel of a systematized effort and legal prosecution being used to discredit and silence her. This is an issue that requires urgent attention around the world. We need to understand the full impact of the crisis and find solutions for it. Maria and Julie, thank you very much for joining us today. All of us here are well aware of the horrific volume of threats to cause physical harm against you, Maria. There's been startling visibility regarding that. Julie, the report uses the term online violence to encompass a wide range of online attacks, from denigration of journalists' reputations to threats of physical harm. Why do you call all of these activities online violence?
So we made a deliberate decision, Richard, to use language that has been used by the UN for a number of years now. And that language has been used in that way, partly as a reflection of the developments in the approach to dealing with, say, domestic violence or sexual violence against women. So if we talk now about domestic violence, we also refer to psychological violence and economic violence. So these other elements that, on top of physical violence and coercive behavior, for example, we see a pattern of violence that undermines gender equality and exposes women to increased physical risk, but also recognizes that psychological damage is a significant form of violence that can be inflicted in gendered attacks. And that's very true in terms of online violence. So we say that there are three key elements. One is this abuse, harassment, and the leveling of threats, which often include threats of sexual violence and death threats and threats of sexual violence against members of the women journalists' families, for example, along with the digital security and safety risks, such as surveillance and other forms of interception. So those sorts of threats that are frequently involved in these attacks. Then there's the role of disinformation, particularly coordinated and orchestrated. And we see that as a feature of online violence as well. So we've made this deliberate choice. Those are the key features of it. And we think that it's important to use these concrete words to sort of raise awareness about the seriousness of this problem.
Thank you. That's I think, very helpful and useful. Your research and our experiences, I think, show that these are not usually just random trolls. It would be far simpler were it just to that. But instead, it's gone beyond that to orchestrated campaigns. Maria, can you give us some background as to how that has evolved and happened and is happening in the Philippines and elsewhere?
So first of all, thanks. It is so good to be with the two of you. And I wish it was the other way and I was asking you questions, Richard, but you are the tech trying to figure out all of this stuff. And then, one of the things few people know about Julie is we first met in 2014, precisely because she was looking at women founders or women's roles in journalism. So it's almost like the world turned completely upside down because we went from doing something, from leading news organizations to now being the target. On your question, look, I think you can see this in the data and the way the attacks were chunked. The attacks against me were 60% were all about calling me a liar, tearing down trust. And when you dig into the networks that were like pushing this at velocity, you will see that they were ultimately connected to either pro-Duterte supporters or government officials or consultants of government. So unlike, say, other countries, they weren't anonymous, they weren't bots. The core of the networks is actually a former campaigner, someone who campaigned for then Mayor Duterte and now is a government official. So all of it is the goal: tear down trust, pound one narrative, something perceived to be critical. I guess my voice is perceived to be critical. Pound that to silence, and then create and engulf with a bandwagon effect that makes it look like the world believes I'm a liar. That's Oxford University called it manufactured consensus. Lots of names for it, but in the end, it's about insidious manipulation to tear down trust. If you can tear down trust, then you can then replace that narrative. If people don't know whom to trust or what to trust in, then the voice with the loudest megaphone gains greater power. And then beyond that, power can replace that, put in a new meta narrative. Sorry, you both know I can dive deep into this stuff. It's been fascinating. I just wish I wasn't the target.
Right, and in a sense, as you've experienced, particularly in the Philippines, with political leaders, unfortunately, the world of politics is often spins around the notion of how do I denigrate the opponent? How do I reduce trust in my opponent? And whoever might be, able to affect that, including journalists. So it's obviously it's a tricky problem to address, as daunting and crucial it is that we figure out how to address it. Julie, we also know well of Maria's experience, but interestingly, your report demonstrates that some women are more likely to be targeted than others.
Mm.
Why is that?
Well, I guess for two essential reasons. One, that when women are targeted, they're targeted in the context of, historic systemic misogyny. So they're targeted because they're women, not just because they're journalists. So in Maria's case study, we saw that 60% of the attacks, when we analysed the 500,000 odd posts on Facebook and Twitter with colleagues from the University of Sheffield, we found that 60%, as she said, were about undermining her professional credibility and trying to shut down her journalism. But 40% of the attacks, which were also used to achieve that end goal, were very personal. The dominant theme was misogynistic and sexist attacks. Then on top of that, and this points to sort of intersectional risks, so women of colour, gay women, women of minority religions, if you layer on those additional forms of risk and vulnerability, those women at the intersection of all of those forms of discrimination are exponentially more likely to be targeted. Then you look at the forms of coverage that women are doing. They're targeted because powerful men want them to shut up. And it's not just powerful men, but overwhelmingly that's what the data tells us, and that includes political actors. But also they want them to stop reporting on themes that are perceived to be stories that men should be reporting on. So everything from, sport through to economics. But when they report on gender issues, so reproductive rights, right from abortion, right through to issues of, say, transphobic discrimination, this is a real lightning rod. We found something like, I think 49% of the women we surveyed, and we surveyed 900 journalists around the world, and around 49% of those surveyed said that gender was the top trigger, reporting on gender issues. But the next most prevalent issue was reporting on political issues, followed by human rights issues, migration, then disinformation, and investigative reporting was on an equal level with disinformation. So what that tells you is that as women increasingly have put their heads above the parapets and have fought damn hard to get the right to report on what used to be considered hard news stories that were the preserve of men, they become more visible and more vulnerable. And these attacks are about not just chilling their reporting, but trying to disappear them, from our public sphere, which now is so much about the digital.
Well, and disappearance terrifyingly can be far beyond the digital sphere.
Yeah.
As you note in the report, online threats of violence can lead to real world violence. Yeah. Have you been able to track the linkage of virtual attacks to real world violence? And is there, in a sense, an identifiable ratio between the two? Are we seeing a linked progression here? One would expect to.
Yeah. Look, we are. I think we have to be a bit cautious about the data. I think a lot more research needs to be done to track individual cases, but we now have enough to be able to comfortably say there is an increasing risk of online violence spilling offline. And one data point that we have from our research is that among the 900 odd journalists that we surveyed, 20% identified, so 20% of the women participants identified having been attacked offline, so harassed, abused, or physically attacked offline in connection with online violence. And that they described things like, people shouting abusive hashtags at them. They described being called out by name, based on things that they had said, or false accusations and conspiracy theories or disinformation-based attacks. Elements of those attacks were then drawn to their attention offline. So we can correlate it that way by lived experience. But we can also see in Maria's case, we refer to this in the report, that online violence and the manipulation of this, digital information ecosystem by state actors, in the case of the Philippines, Duterte, has created this enabling environment for Maria's, physical and legal persecution and prosecution and conviction. So there's a legal element to this too. And we had some really horrifying accounts from women we interviewed around the world who talked about, really horrendous threats of physical violence, but who also talked about having experiences of being yelled at in supermarkets, with these sorts of hashtag type vitriol-based attacks. There's a journalist called Patricia Devlin in Northern Ireland who was the subject of really brutal online attacks, and who then found herself named next to the crosshairs of a gun painted on the sides of buildings in Belfast. So we can see the connections quite clearly when we look in a granular way at some of these attacks.
It makes it particularly challenging when some of these efforts against the press, many of these efforts against the press, are actually driven by political leadership. Clearly Duterte in the Philippines is a prime example, but not limited to there. We certainly saw it in the United States during the last administration, when the press were frequently referred to as enemies of the people. And things progressed more darkly from there. So, which obviously makes addressing this a particular challenge. One thing that occurred to me as we take and also try to figure out how to address these things is are the legal frameworks we currently have sufficient to the problem? And I'd like both of you to consider this question. But I'm going to start again with Julie one more time. In doing your research, were you able to categorize the online attacks as they map against current legal frameworks in various countries? And obviously it varies in many countries. Hate speech alone is defined quite differently in various countries.
Yeah.
So what extent does this behavior fall inside or outside the bounds of legal frameworks of expression?
It's a really good question, and we have done extensive research on this very issue. It hasn't appeared in the extract that was published last week, but it will be covered in detail in the book-length version of this study, which will come out later this year, published by UNESCO. But just to give you some broad brush findings from that legal-based research, again, we can draw on the survey and we can see that only 8% of the women we surveyed had taken any kind of legal action. 11% had made complaints to the police. So we're starting from a very low base in terms of awareness on the part of the women, or willingness or capability, and there are so many barriers to taking any kind of legal or judicial recourse. Then there's the question of capability at the law enforcement and judicial level. It's very poor because this is very new and it's very difficult to conceptualize. We had some examples of judges saying, well, unless there's been a physical attack, it doesn't amount to a hill of beans. This is not a direct quote from a judge, but this is the sort of perception. But what we then did is recognizing two key problems. One, that we're talking about US-based tech companies that have operated within the parameters of US law, but whose platforms and services and networks are facilitating this problem globally, with impacts in countries that are well beyond what we could have expected traditionally to occur in a US environment. So the First Amendment and interpretations of the First Amendment as though this were appropriate as the only form of kind of legal framework or instrument to dealing with problems like hate speech, networked hate speech, and viral disinformation is problematic. And so what we did was look at the international human rights legal frameworks and the normative values that go alongside that. And there are several, principles and several documents that are really useful. So there's the Ruggie principles, which were about trying to get corporate behavior to align at an international level, like big corporate actors, which big tech is obviously a key element of, do align with human rights principles and to first do no harm as a kind of guide. There's lots of technical language we could apply there. And then there's also a set of protocols designed to recognize that freedom of expression has very narrow, very exceptional limitations. And those limitations very much do correlate with hate speech and the threat of viral hate speech spilling offline in the ways it's done in India, in Myanmar, for example, in the Philippines. And so what you will see when this comes out is an attempt to try and create understanding about these international principles and thinking about how they could inform the conduct that we think needs to change within companies like yours, Richard.
And by the way, I would note, from our perspective, and we don't attempt to operate globally under U.S. law. I mean, we can't actually. We operate under the laws of the countries that we operate in, which makes obviously all of this more challenging in terms of ultimately how one addresses it. Particularly if there's a desire for government action, for legislative action to address what we might believe are holes in the legal framework today. But Maria, I'd love you to weigh in on this because I know you've thought a lot about the solution space as well.
Well, first, just like in my own country, right, it would be really hard to think about what legislation this government would do because this is state sponsored, right? We know it is state sponsored. The evidence and the data shows that. And beyond that, actually, Richard, this is interesting because I'd never really phrased it this way. Just talking to you reminded me, in the last year, the government has used social media to do something called red tagging. Red tagging means pinpointing a target and calling them communist, i.e. a terrorist. So think about it like McCarthyism, except when that is done to you by a military, there's a government task force that is now doing this consistently. When that's done by a military officer or a policeman or a government official in the real world, and then it's amplified on social media, and then you put it add an overlay of an anti-terror law where if cabinet officials say you are a terrorist, red tagged, then you could be arrested without an arrest warrant and jailed for up to 24 days. This anti-terror law has 37 petitions at the Supreme Court demanding it be declared unconstitutional. So all of that to say that, the journalists, human rights activists, and opposition politicians who have been red tagged in this kind of, compare it to McCarthyism, well, some of those human rights activists have been attacked online and then killed. One woman I can think of off the top of my head is Sarah Alvarez. She actually went to the court to ask for protection, and that case is on appeal. But last August, she was walking down the street at night. She had just bought her dinner with her two friends, and a guy came up behind her and pumped 3 bullets into her back. And then when she was on the ground, shot her 3 more times to make sure she was dead. Anyway, sorry. I've been going through all of the escalated violence. I guess what I'm saying is in my country, the law, there's Laila de Lima, who's a senator, has been in jail this is her 5th year. Last February began her 5th year in prison. President Duterte threatened her. She was investigating him for extrajudicial killings back from when he was still a mayor in Davao City. Well, she's been in jail for 5 years on what many human rights activists say are trumped up drug charges. And I guess she coined this term called lawfare. So Amnesty International calls her a prisoner of conscience. She says this is lawfare, using the law against her. Okay, so that's where law is in our country. I don't believe that I can rely on our legislature to actually, it's pretty much a captive legislature, but I do rely on a global system that recognizes this problem, and studies like this actually help point that out, that Actually, Richard, it was in December of 2016 at the News Lab, where I was saying, what's happening here is it can come your way. Our dystopian present is your future. So this is happening all around the world, and what we're hoping for is meaningful legislation. One that addresses the problems, puts guardrails on the tech, and allows us to be able to use the tech for good, because I don't think that will ever go away. The Pandora's box is open, and we're going to have to navigate the evils. And the sooner we can put these guardrails in, the easier it will be for all of us to be able to solve the big problems we actually have.
No, that's a good point. You're at the same time, of course, what you've said, specifically lawfare, which it's a great term. It frankly, it's not an uncommon behavior. We've witnessed this. And you raised the blacklist. My own father-in-law was put in jail in the 50s for his political beliefs in the United States. How do you solve a problem that you don't necessarily trust your governments to solve is obviously the immense challenge here. So let's shift in a sense to the solution space. You call appropriately online violence the new front line of journalism safety. And as you point out, Julie, cannot afford to be normalized or tolerated. I think everyone here would agree with that. But let's talk about solutions. What needs to be done? What can be done? What's our realistic sense of the possible?
Yeah, I think I don't. Sorry, was that a question for me? Yeah.
Yeah, both of you in this case.
Yes, good. Shall I start, Maria, and then you can come in? I think Maria and I are of one mind that this is, this is a problem that needs to be addressed in a systemic way. It needs to be addressed at the level of the design and business models of the platforms, as well as it needs to be addressed in the context of news industry responses, political party responses. And as Maria's pointed out, we can't rely on the governments of nations that are tilting towards fascism to regulate in a way that both addresses these core problems of viral disinformation and hate speech as it serves to chill critical independent reporting. For example, we have to look to intergovernmental organizations, so in the UN context, and we have to look at the corporations that are, let's face it, enabling this to happen by virtue of the tools that we have all become so reliant on. These problems, the attacks on journalists, the jailing, the assassination of journalists, these problems have gone on for decades and decades, long before the social platforms and networks existed. What's changed is the highly networked nature of this, the scale of the attacks, and in association with that, the scale of the impacts. And so I'm not trying to avoid the question of solutions, but I feel that we're still very much in the grip of trying to understand this problem in a way that helps us inform the solutions. But what I have seen in the course of researching this for the past 5 or 6 years, in fact, I first started looking at this issue of online violence with journalists being attacked way back in 2010, when I was looking at social media as a transformative focus for journalism, as many of us were focused on, a decade ago. And it's gotten so much worse since then, but it's gotten way more complex. And as much as just to come back to what you were saying earlier, Rich, as much as I understand and appreciate that companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter, and name your big tech organization, do have to operate within the boundaries of local laws in the countries that they operate, one of the problems we've encountered is that the philosophy and the kind of legal guiding principles within the organizations, the US-based ones at least, have been so hesitant to address these sorts of attacks based on the false notion that to do so, to try to curtail one person's speech, was not a way to deal with the suppression of another's freedom of expression. And I think that's a distinction between US-based legal frameworks and sort of international understandings of human rights law. And I think now we seem to be coming to a realization, even if we just think about what happened overnight with the Facebook Oversight Board decision on the permanent banning or otherwise of Donald Trump, we see a recognition that it is not, impossible to try and regulate within these corporate spaces in ways that at least attempt to address the overflow of hate speech. Over to you, Maria. Sorry, I could go on all day about this point, but I won't.
Repeat just the last part that shows the possibility of.
Well, I think it shows. I think it shows a bit of movement. So in the case, if we look at that Facebook determination, for example, we saw as a result of the storming of the Capitol and Facebook's horror at the way that Donald Trump was using that platform to inspire the kind of insurrection that took place, he was banned. It took a very long time for Facebook to acknowledge the level of the problem and make a decision to push him off. In fact, Facebook executives were on record, and we note this in another book we wrote for UNESCO called the Balancing Act, that it was regularly argued that to kick a US politician off a site run by a US-based technology company would require some sort of next level disobedience and misconduct. And it took that, to get them to the point of doing that. Now that's happened, it strikes me that the community of tech and human rights and journalism, we are now having the discussion about how we then put processes and principles and frameworks in place to ensure that those sorts of decisions can be made in ways that are, measurable and appropriate and proportionate and so on.
Yeah, I mean, but I don't. At the same time, I don't want us to shy away from the really thorny complexity of the challenge, right? I mean, as Maria and I have often discussed, what the internet did basically was put a printing press in everyone's hands. What the internet did was enable free expression in many ways, what we would see as the ideal. Now, of course, that also comes with consequences, as people have opined since the since the beginning of printing. The interesting challenge for a platform is just that point of how far to what extent is it even appropriate or acceptable or viable to behave in an extra legal fashion? I mean, I have been in many circumstances, where we are, say, criticized for having, say, bias in our ranking conservatively in one direction or the other. When we do take action, during the last administration, when we took action against a particularly problematic voice on YouTube, the threat was Justice Department investigations. So it's the consequences are not insignificant. The pressures are not insignificant on either side of the equation. So it's a particular challenge. I mean, I think that, but I think it's important for us to recognize.
But I would say that those are big challenges, and Maria can pick up on this for corporations. Of course, they're largely challenges of a legal and profit nature. Whereas for the people who are being impacted on the ground, the consequences are frankly deadly. And I think that's where we have to really work harder and faster to try and figure out solutions that are sustainable.
They are of a legal and an existential nature. I don't see it so much as a profit nature, except with the very existential question of, are you allowed to operate or are you not allowed to operate? I don't think there's anyone in the platform space who would look at this and say, this is the kind of content that helps drive our revenue, because it does not. But in any case, Maria.
No, I'm going to bridge both of you, because in the end, I think, these attacks on women journalists is one of the fracture lines, and part of the reason women are attacked. And this, I was just looking at Turkey, right, Richard, one of our conversations, because I was thinking, what was there before social media? where were countries where strongman rulers were coming up already? So I looked at Turkey. And what was interesting is a journalist there, Etche Temelkuran, wrote this book about how to lose a country. And in her book, she actually says that attacking women, the misogyny, the sexism, attacking the vulnerable communities is almost goes hand in hand with the rise of fascism. Right? These are her words. So that's interesting to me. But how do I bridge both of you? Well, so if you think of that as a tactic, another tactic in the United States is Russian disinformation coming in and pounding the fracture lines of Black Lives Matter on both sides, right? So the end goal is truly just to pound, number one, to make society vulnerable by tearing apart trust. Right. So we go to that. And this goes to what you said, Richard, about, making a call. And if you take down someone like Trump, then you're biased against Trump. No, I think the bias, every algorithm, every platform will have a bias, right? Film we talked about called Coded Bias was biased that, a woman at MIT needed to put on a white mask in order for the AI to recognize her face. So there is bias in there, but how about putting the bias on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or being biased for facts, right? Or being biased for safety. I guess that's so, but that's not your problem. But so here's I think the fundamental problem is that when facts are torn apart, and that is actually what information operations are doing, why the social media platforms enable it, and that is connected to their business model, because Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism, because the incentives, they make the social media platforms get more engagement, make more money, because lies laced with, I say this all the time, so you both have heard me say this, lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts. 2018 Science Magazine study that was done on Twitter. We've done similar things on Facebook, sure. Right? So the last thing is, if you don't have facts, you can't have truth, you can't have trust. Without trust, you can't have democracy, you can't deal with the coronavirus, you can't deal with climate. Without trust, and that's the part that's hard. And this is where I'll connect the platforms with the impact of it on us, with societal issues at mass scale, right? Because platforms will always say we want it at scale. Well, these are 81 democracies around the world, according to Oxford University's Computational Propaganda Research Project, where cheap armies on social media rolled back democracy. We're paying a price for this. And I'm just starting to get really angry that I keep that I'm the target. But for many years, I found it fascinating to be the target because you can study it, right? Geek, I've gone to both of you with this, but I'm tired of studying it because now it hasn't gotten better. And I guess that's the difference. And I'll connect it back to the Facebook oversight board. I'm part of the real Facebook oversight board where, we said these are systemic issues. And it feels like it's a riff, right? Facebook will set up an oversight board and that will take months. An oversight board that will never be able to deal with the attacks at the scale and the pace that they come in. But it's a veneer. Anyway, I'll shut up, right? But you can see the issues are fundamental. And this is only, this study only looks at one part of it. There could be a whole study on well, there have been the Russian disinformation on Black Lives Matter, on minorities, on the kind of the way the disinformation networks that were created for political power have also been connected to the anti-vax movements, right? It is not a coincidence that outbreaks of measles in states where there were active disinformation networks and influence operations, information operations, and in countries like the Philippines, we had an outbreak of measles. So these things all go hand in hand, and it is about power and money.
I agree with large parts of that. I do want to come back to what I think is the ultimate and trickiest of questions that I think confronts us as societies. on the one hand, again, the internet has enabled free expression at large. The challenge we face is the tricky one of how do we manage free expression in open societies? And any answer to that question has to be incredibly nuanced and detailed, right? It can't be just high level concepts. It's a grayscale, and it goes back to the question of legal frameworks, from what is technically illegal versus not. I mean, hate speech, right? Again, in the United States, hate speech to be illegal, you pretty much have to say, meet me at the corner of First and Main, bring your guns because we're going to attack that person.
Yeah.
I don't think we can shy away from the trickiness of addressing those very precise questions as to what we can and should not, should or should not enable. And in fact, I think part of, I was going to go to the next question of which I will, which is what can the media do to attempt to address this problem as well as its own behavior. And I know one challenge I've had is that I don't think the media necessarily covers this issue terribly well. But I'm going to go back to the larger question of what can the media do to address this? Are newsroom leaders doing the right thing in terms of their own actions and how they support their teams of reporters, including women who are attacked online?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying that I think Rappler has been one of the exemplar news organizations, actually, and it's not surprising considering that they've been both early targets and early adopters of kind of appropriate solutions, or as solutions is too broad a description because we're not solving this, we're just surviving it at the moment. But it's a women-led news organization, and they have combined psychological support with physical security, increased tech, safety and security training, all of the basic things that we've known, for close to 10 years are good ways of trying to defend yourself against these sorts of online attacks. But the nature of the state instigated and at scale fueling of these attacks on Rappler has given them a real life case study while their lives are on the line. So that's the sort of innovation under pressure. But unfortunately, in our research, we've seen examples around the world, and often these include some of the biggest, richest news organizations internationally, including within Western liberal democracies, where what we've identified as a sort of speech policing of women. So ironically, we're talking here about the need to curtail what I would call unfettered speech rather than freedom of expression, which I think is what we're seeing now. Just everybody thinks they've got a right to say whatever the hell they want about anybody to anybody with any kind of impact whatsoever. Whereas, the international legal frameworks around hate speech are nowhere near as stringent as the requirements you just outlined in the US. There are processes designed to protect those targeted who on the basis of anti-discrimination law in many Western liberal democracies, for example. But we won't go down that path again, but it is nuanced. But in newsroom context, what we're seeing is both a reluctance on the part, particularly in the US, for all of the reasons we've just discussed, news employers, media employers taking any kind of legal action to defend their journalists, because to do so is seen to be an attack on free speech. So what they worry about is if we make a complaint to the police, or if we make a complaint to, through legal recourse of some means. So for example, any kind of libel action, this would be perceived to be inappropriate conduct for a news organization. So that's one interesting challenge that we have to deal with. So there's this real reluctance to escalate these issues. The second point, though, is that despite that, there's a policing and a victim blaming of the women themselves. So it's easier for the news organizations to say, women, stop speaking. Do not engage with people who are harassing you. Don't talk about it openly because it just triggers more attacks. And I think that don't feed the trolls is a deeply problematic way of trying to approach this problem, because what it does is it puts the blame on the women themselves. You know, they become both the primary targets and the first responders. And so we have to really figure out different ways of dealing with this. And there are, you know, cases in the public domain of women being sacked and suspended because of their response to attacks they're undergoing online. So news organizations absolutely have a huge responsibility. Some are trying hard, some are doing creative things, some are putting protocols in place, they're increasing training. There's still a real gender blindness though, for the most part, where this is a problem of online harassment or violence that is not necessarily understood to have such significant impacts on women particularly, that needs to be addressed. So yeah, there are some changes. There's also still a real difficulty facing the news organizations, because they will say, well, we can deal with what's below the line, you know, on the comments section of our website. We can't, of course, control what happens on the platforms. So, you know, it's gnarly.
So interestingly, and I think you do touch on this a bit in the report, and everything you say there is obviously challenging and problematic. Take it up a level. There was a recent study from the University of Michigan that showed that divisiveness in the United States was more pronounced among cohorts of the citizenry that did not use the internet. Right, which means they were largely bathed in legacy media.
Yeah, and we see that coming out very much in the kind of the polarized press, so the partisan press in the US. So you see what we aren't mapping though is the way that the online violence will occur targeting someone like Taylor Lorenz at the New York Times, for example, who's one of our interviewees in this study. So the mob gets called onto Taylor, often instigated by partisan or misogynistic male journalists. Then it skips to Fox News and Tucker Carlson has a go. And then those who are not traditional users of the internet escalate it further. So it's all interrelated. So yes,
you're absolutely right. It is all interrelated. And I think that's certainly, and again, part of my perspective on this is just saying, it's just for us to make sure to recognize that the problem is enormously complex, both from a standpoint of what precisely are we trying to control, and via various dimensions of the communication space, as well as the legal space. But you're absolutely right. But the big megaphones of media obviously do trigger the cascading, tumult of what happens in the online space, and sometimes in reverse as well.
Yeah. Does Maria do you want to talk about that at all, Maria, before we go to questions? Because I've just been pinged to say we have loads of questions, so we can have from the audience. We're going to have to get to those.
Just like to quickly add on that is that I think in the old world, before social media, I'll call it the old world, right? There are laws. There are laws in the physical world. There are laws in the old world in the sense of if a news organization did some of the things that the social media platforms do, we would be held liable for it. It doesn't directly translate, but the principles do, the values do. That's why, Richard, I don't think it is that difficult if you go to the principles. And every journalist will call a story slightly differently, but the standards and ethics used to be similar up until everything broke, right? We already know when it did in the United States. But what Julie showed, which is this seeding of meta-narratives, it's not just targeting individuals. The whole Stop the Steal, Trump's election fraud was seeded as a meta-narrative August of 2019, way before. So more than a year before it ended in January 6th, right? It was seeded on RT in August 2019, picked up by Steve Bannon on YouTube, then brought to Tucker Carlson Again, all of these names are familiar, right? And then it came down in QAnon in September 2020, right before the elections. And then President Trump came with the same narrative top down. And that's the way something, a meta narrative that isn't true, becomes a reality, and you get a mob on Capitol Hill. This is really dangerous, not just for individuals, but for society. And I guess that's part of it. We've been talking over years about how complex it all is, but the complexity is not an excuse to not do something about it. And that's the way the whack-a-mole approach of, I sound radical now, right? But it's just because it's been 5 years, Richard. You know.
And no, and you know that, and obviously, I don't think anyone, including at platforms that you might think are not doing the right jobs, you know, look and says without an ideal solution or approach, we can't do anything. I don't think that's valid at all. I think there are massive efforts that, I can't speak for others, but massive efforts that we apply to try to addressing these challenges. It's a big one. It's a significant one.
But Google is ahead a little bit only because the links page rank actually is anchored in the real world, in credibility built up over time. But I think not even you will be, as time moves on, right? We've discussed this. As time moves on, the crowd, the wisdom of the crowd should be retained. Don't let the crowd turn into a mob. And that's what's happened on social media. And we can see this escalating in other parts of the internet if we don't put the guardrails in place. And I don't mean to sacrifice free expression or free speech. We are advocates of that. It's just, you can't yell bomb at the airport.
And I'm going to go to questions. Richard, we've got quite a few, and I don't know if you guys also want to look at Zoom.
I was answering some, but go
ahead.
I
think we have been answering some as we go. But just before I pull one up that we need to answer, just on the question of Google. I mean, Richard, you know, in the report we refer to cases of women various places around the world highlighting YouTube as, you know, the place which is more problematic for them. We don't necessarily hear that terribly much in the West. You know, usually it's Facebook or Twitter that are singled out as the platforms. But Khada Awais, who's a principal presenter in Arabic for Al Jazeera, still says one of the worst experiences she's had is that YouTube is just flooded with disinformation laced and everything from deep fakes through to you know, highly disinformation oriented narratives about her. She says that you can't surface her interviews anymore because it's full of propaganda pushed by foreign state actors, you know, through YouTube. So I think what Maria says is, yes, you know, this is it's starting to spread in ways and happening in places in experimental ways that we can imagine it will happen elsewhere, the way it gets ported. But I just want to make that point. I think it's important to note that, and you might have something to say about that. I know you've dealt with Maria and on that issue.
Yeah, there's not too much I can say since I don't work at YouTube. I'm not responsible for their efforts, though. I know they're making determined ones. But you know, in a sense, what you cite, I mean, YouTube, in a sense, like Facebook, these are open social networking environments, and which is the particular challenge, right? Because it's much more organic, as Maria points out. For instance, with Google search, the challenge is significant, but it is also to some degree more manageable because you have a longer history of understanding the different voices, which you don't necessarily, much trickier to master in the social networking environment in its associated virality. But let's go to the questions. I mean, you know, at core of this, not at core, but one of the key issues here is understanding and respecting the role of journalism and the role of the press in the first place, you know, and that obviously is one of the things that's being deteriorated. It's not just the attacks on individual journalists, it's the attacks on journalism in general.
Yeah.
Enemies of the people, as it were. What is the role of media literacy in campaigns to better explain to our societies the importance of press freedom, and how can that contribute to tackling disinformation? This is a question from Christina Zahar. And how can media outlets and journalists help address this issue?
Do you want me to start, Maria, with that, or do you want to start? Look, I think media and information literacy is really important. I would say that it is a medium to long-term solution. Journalists clearly have a role, hopefully in a collaborative way with audiences, to help develop the skills of citizens with regard to critically assessing information and rejecting and deflecting disinformation, for example, and with explaining their role in ways that are meaningful to the average citizen, to help them to understand that media freedom is not just about the right of journalists to do their job, it's also about the right of every citizen to access critical and accurate and reliable information. Media freedom is everyone's freedom if we are to be able to access information outside of the toxic swamp that we're currently swimming in. And I think that is very important. But what I would say also is that we can't deflect responsibility for solving this problem to individual citizens or journalists in reference to individual citizens. It's not a standalone solution. And I think there is some criticism justified back to the tech companies with it, when there's too much of an emphasis on media and information literacy as a potential solution. It's fantastic that companies like Google are investing in it. It's fantastic that companies like Facebook are investing in it. But as long as the investment is paralleled with support for genuinely independent journalism, at arm's length investment, I would argue, and also addressing the systemic, design and business model issues within the companies themselves. Maria.
I would agree it's a medium and a long-term solution, but the biggest problem is that our social media platforms are designed, by design, they appeal to our emotions. So if you think of, it's a thinking fast platform, that is the way information flows through it. It plays with and uses our emotions in a hyper socialized environment, meaning that, even the degrees of separation in the real world are 6 degrees of separation. On Facebook, it's 3.57 degrees. That's part of what leads to the virality of information, right? But again, to go back to that thinking fast, thinking slow, the 2 systems of thinking, that's from a book by Daniel Kahneman. Our platforms, the social media platforms, are thinking fast platforms. They appeal to our emotions, and the people who do well there manipulate our emotions. And I'm not gonna, that can be both good and bad, but I think bad is disinformation networks, right? The ones that are trying to manipulate us for evil, right? So that kind of thing, media literacy will not help as much, right? The other problem is that journalism, the study that you're listening to, this conversation we're having, is a thinking slow process. If you want to try to take apart the ideas, it's not about me like yelling angry things at you so you get angry, which is kind of what's happened on social media. That's the part that I think needs to change. And part of the reason that anger and hate and conspiracy theories flow faster is because that's what gets the most engagement. So I'll end it with this, right? I always say, one of the things I think social media, and when I read things from my favorite social media platform, which by the way, Rappler is a Facebook partner for the record, we're also partners with Google.
So is ICFJ. I mean, I think that's important to
We're
know.
all
Working with at the same time as being critical appropriately. Yeah.
So I would say like now I forgot where I was headed. Where was I headed, June?
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, what? So I guess the last chunk of it is that we need to find ways to think slow, because if we don't have that, then we can't actually engage with each other in any meaningful way.
Mhm.
And that goes back to Richard's bias, right? So what are the bias? I would say right now, the social media platforms in general are biased against facts. They're biased against meaningful conversations, right? That's problematic for all of us.
Mhm. There's one question that I think we should try and answer, which before we wind up, and it goes to the question of verified accounts and real naming conventions. You know, should we have a response to this problem that assumes that anonymous accounts are a big part of the challenge, and therefore respond by making verification the kind of, you know, the norm. And I'm the first one as somebody who, you know, wrote a PhD thesis all about the need to preserve encryption and anonymity for the sake of source protection. So I'm the last person to suggest that this is the solution to obliterate the right to anonymity. But Richard, I don't know, I'm suddenly interviewing you, but what do you think about that? And Maria as well. That the question is, why don't we push for social media accounts to be all verified so it's easy to identify who's attacking, and then the courts can decide, presuming the courts are in an environment where there is rule of law, the courts can decide if the attack goes beyond the bounds of freedom of expression.
Yeah, I mean, that's we're not going to resolve this one in the next minute or two. You know, that's a question I've had to think about for like 30 years or more, including back in some pre-internet online spaces where, you know, in one online service I ran, which was at Apple, you know, we had a model where since they were paying accounts, we actually did have a pretty good understanding of the identity. We did allow pseudonymity, but we allowed pseudonymity with the rule that said that you had to declare that it was a pseudonym.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I think there are some interesting approaches there, but, you know, there too, there's quite a few different elements to it. There's one more question on here that I think we should address. And by the way, on the media literacy question, I agree. It's obviously not the solution. On the other hand, I do think we need to recognize, I'll take it up a level, you know, one of my deepest concerns is that a lot of these efforts, and particularly led by bad actor states and so on, is about denigrating democracies themselves.
Yeah.
And, you know, the particularly challenging research that we see, including in North America, is the declining regard for democracy in and of itself. And obviously, if we can't turn that around, then we're not going to turn around these issues either. So there are indeed important roles from an educational standpoint, but they're not, you know, they're certainly not going to have an immediate impact on some of the challenges we're seeing here. But the one question I thought we might want to address before wrapping up was a question from Nusrat Siddiq. Basically, is what's the tips and advice you would give to women journalists who are out there trying to do challenging reporting and find themselves vulnerable to the kinds of attacks that we're seeing? How would you advise them?
Maria.
Yeah, I'm going to take that one first. And this connects to Jen Rubio also. You have a question there of, you know, should we just expose them? And I will say, shine the light, right? That's the first. I think the first thing for women under attack is look at yourself. Hillary Clinton said something like this, which is, what's the criticism? If the criticism is valid, then shift. But if it's not valid and it is an attack meant to silence you, then shine the light, right? Especially if it is exponential and it is work related. And I got that great advice from Julie Posetti in 2016 or 20, you know, and I actually at that point was kind of like embarrassed by it. And I thought, maybe I'm doing something wrong, because we tend to take it in and absorb it. But the reality is that it won't stop, especially if we're doing investigative reporting that they want to stop.
Yeah.
So just shine the light, expose it, and they will actually either stop or evolve. And then we can demand greater protection, which is what we're doing now.
And I would add to that, you know, raise your voice while recognizing that it may not be safe to do so for all women. It may not be safe in the sense of causing, psychological injury because you're exposing yourself to increased risk. That's a completely valid reaction. But if you have the capacity to do so, raise your voice and continue to report on the issues that there are attempts to shut you out of or shut you down from pursuing. And find solidarity with other women. This is now what the only upside of all this is, that it's now so widespread that women in New York, to Karachi, from Sydney to Johannesburg are experiencing this, and Manila. And you will find women in online communities, ironically, who are forming back-channel conversations to support one another. But continuing to talk about it, as difficult as it might be, means that news organizations, the platforms, governments, the UN will not be able to turn away. I mean, I've had the extraordinary experience of interviewing dozens of women myself, and the broader research team interviewed 170 odd. And do you know what? 95% of them chose to put their names to the statements they made, which is so unusual in research about journalism. How brave is that? You're going against the tide. And I think that boldness and that bravery is part of the solution. And now we have to listen to the women who are speaking, and we have to actually work collaboratively, critically, continuing to challenge one another, and have these really difficult conversations, but keep them going, and work together on practical, concrete solutions.
Sorry, can I add two things? Get your organization. So what we did were two immediate things, right? We increased security because online violence leads to real world violence. And we offered counseling because Rappler is 63% women, and our median age is 23 years old, and I'm old. So you can see how young our folks are. So, if it plays with your head, get help, talk to people. That's what the solidarity is for. If the threats are constant, ask for help. We increased security 6 times in the first year.
Well, I think we're at time, but I want to both close and give you each an opportunity for any closing statements or thoughts you'd like to share. I first want to thank you hugely for participating. Julie, thank you hugely for continuing to shine light on the issue. I think we can't solve problems that we don't understand. And I think we have yet to fully understand this in its implications and its solutions as well. But thank you for moving the ball forward on that, Julie. And Maria, as ever, thank you for bringing your wisdom and experience to the discussion as well. But Julie, why don't you drop in with any closing statements you'd like to make?
I think I've said more than enough, and I'm going to give the last word to Maria. But I just want to emphasize again how important she has been as a voice over the past 4 or 5 years to draw our attention to this issue. And Agnes Calomar, who's was one of the special rapporteurs for the UN, who's now heading up Amnesty International, always refers to Maria as the emblematic case, where all of the issues that journalists are struggling with kind of intersect. And I think, we continue to celebrate her, as well as having her back through the Hold the Line coalition, which ICFJ is a part of. So, and Maria, can you take the floor?
No, I mean, thank you for the help, for helping us shine the light. But I would turn this around on everyone watching, because I think, and we've been talking about horrific things and how we can fix it, right? But here's the empowering thing. This is why I wake up really energized. This moment that we're living in is an incredible moment, and we don't feel it because we're in the middle of the horribleness of it. COVID here, online. Every one of us who's dealing with information or whatever career you are in, we're creating something that is completely different from the world that was, precisely because coronavirus also threw it out. So I guess that's the last thing is, please go back. And I know I have at least Mary Slattery is a classmate of mine. I know she's also here, right? So we're going to our 35th year reunion at the end of May, right? So the question here is what are your values? Because we're going to create the world. Richard is actively creating the world. Some of us have more power, some of us have less, but we have to go back to, you know, who are you? What do you stand for? What do you want the world to be? Because that is the bigger picture of what we want the internet to be. What world do we want? And we actually have the ability to create it now.
Thank you. Sharon?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And thank you all. That was a really, really great conversation. And I think we all learned a lot and were inspired by your example, as always, Maria. Speaking of which, you may be wondering what you can do to support Maria as she battles lawfare in the Philippines. That is a great term. So you can show your support by getting a mask that says "Courage On" or "Hold the Line." These are two of Maria's catchphrases. You can see mine here. You can get it from ICFJ.org. There should be a link in the chat. All the proceeds are going to go to Maria's Legal Defense Fund. And once you get your mask, we would love for you to share out a photo of yourself out on social media on your verified account on or before June 15th. That would be the 1-year anniversary of Maria's cyber libel conviction. Not a happy anniversary, but an important one. So I think we all know we need to hold the line. Courage on for Maria, for independent media in the Philippines and everywhere. So thanks, Richard, so much. Julie and Maria, thank you again for your time and your work and your energy. So, and thank you all so much for attending. Have a great rest of your day, evening, or morning, wherever you are. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Take care. Bye.